Without further ado, I want to dive in. Welcome, y'all. We are super excited to have you here. Thank you for spending time with us on this lovely Tuesday. Julie and I want to introduce ourselves. As always, if you already know who we are, awesome. You're going to feel like great about knowing us even better. And if you don't know us, well, then here you go. So hello, howdy y'all. My name is Brendan. My pronouns are he, him. You can tweet at me at birdbrainfinch, but I haven't done that stuff in a long time. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years in Los Angeles. I taught for Los Angeles Unified School District and KIPP and Green Dot, a couple of charter networks in LA. I left the classroom 10 years ago to build Rocket Lit. And so that's an adaptive sort of like leveled science reading. And about 5 years ago, we started building Inner Orbit. So that's what we're here to talk about, our assessments for the NGSS. I started writing those assessments initially, and I now spend a lot of my time talking to thought leaders and chatting with folks on what they need and what else we should build to support sort of the other needs they have outside of assessments, and creating content like this to help everyone conceptualize their journey through the NGSS and to make things easier for y'all, whether you're a admin, a teacher, or a student. And I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Julia.
Well, thank you, Brendan. So my name is Julia, and I am a former teacher, and I was also a tutor in the Dominican Republic for elementary students. 100% recommend if you've never been. I've been building materials to support teachers and districts with the NGSS implementation for the past 3 years now. And I'm in Orbit's district engagement manager, which means that if you want to try it out, and if you're interested in getting to know Inner Orbit a little bit more and how it can help your context, you just let me know and shoot me an email and we'll get connected soon.
And you're going to hear Julia talk a lot during this webinar, but you can hear her talk even more about Inner Orbit if you find a time to chat with her. So we always want to start out by explaining what it is that we do so that y'all see the lens through which we are looking to build a future. So Inner Orbit is a pretty simple platform. It's a website. And on that website, we have 4 different things that we offer. So the first are we have these phenomena. So we'll find examples of things in the real world and give students opportunities to not just learn and memorize content, but to take their understandings and their skills and to apply those to make sense of new things. And with those phenomena, with those ways for students to transfer their knowledge and demonstrate that transfer, that application, we have all these really scaffolded questions, and they'll be tied to just a DCI or a DCI and an SEP or a cross-cutting concept in a DCI or all 3 dimensions all together. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on today, and I'll show you around the site real quick. And then finally, because we want folks to be able to reflect on their practice, and if you're a district leader, if you're a school leader, or if you're a teacher, that you need to be able to see information. And so what this is showing is the SEP, the science and engineering practice, developing these models. And after an assessment, multiple assessments in this case were given, we have some data in here, and we see that students did really, really well to develop a model using an analogy, example, or abstract representation. So at the 3-5 grade level at elementary, they did really well with that. And then we also see that at the very, very bottom, there's this reteach red number. And so students struggled to develop a model to describe unobservable mechanisms. So that's a really discrete piece of the middle school grade band of the science and engineering practice, developing using models. And maybe we need to talk about things that are instantaneous and can't be perceived, or things that take longer than like all of humanity has existed for in order for us to observe, or are at such immense scales that it's impossible for us to observe them due to just spatial and time-bound constraints. And so that's something very, very specific that you can sit down with your team and reflect upon, and then make some choices. And because the NGSS are really complex, we also do a lot of professional learning. You're all here enjoying one of those sessions right now, which we're excited to have you join us for. But we try to model engaging practices. We use research to determine what we should be presenting, and feedback drives all of these things. So many of you that are on this call have already given us feedback on things that we've presented on in the past, and we would be really excited to have more feedback from you. But we do these things virtually, or we can go in person to your location and work with you and your teachers or other administrators and help to build up your practice. Speaking of building up your practice, I'm excited for us to dive into our session today. And by the way, so Julie just dropped a link in the chat to our calendar. And if you're watching this as a recording, it is in the description below. But go ahead and click on that if you want to meet with her and talk about inner orbit and learn more about that. But for today, we are here to discuss the pursuit of NGSS assessment excellence. And within that scope, we're going to explore strategies and resources for honing NGSS practices. These are beyond foundational practices, and we're not just preparing students for a test, but preparing them for science beyond state tests. So this is like, how do we get even better? We're going to be here for about an hour, and we may actually finish early this time. I don't know. Julie and I are feeling pretty optimistic today, so that's. I'll just say that with some skepticism. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to revisit a thing that we did not get to touch upon last time because we didn't finish within an hour, and so we had to just say we'll get to that later. So we're going to talk about responding to data with small instructional shifts, and I'm going to take some time to kind of bring you back to what that was all about, and we'll talk about that in a second. With that, we're going to talk about some options for ways you can respond to your data. That's science talks or doing reviews or allowing students to go through a gallery walk. And then we're going to talk about what you do in the future. And this is what we see folks doing that are absolutely at the top of their game and frankly should be advising all of the rest of us for how to implement the NGSS with fidelity and to hone those things. So changing future assessment is a big deal. How do we measure growth from point A to point B? Some of the things that Julia is going to talk to you about around this are using the same phenomena, the same questions, using the same phenomena for different questions, or different phenomena, different questions. There are pros and cons to each of these different ways that you can assess pre and post tests. And Julia is going to talk a lot more about all those things. Then finally, we'll together walk you through a deeper data chat. We're going to look at version A, version B data. So let's say we gave an assessment. We had some activities that we underwent with our students to respond to that data. And now we're looking at the changing data from the version A to the version B. So that'll be really interesting. And then we'll also do some, maybe if we have time, some light question level analysis, looking at these questions and deciding, oh, it's not just the standards, but the questions that may deserve some additional, I guess, reflection. And finally, there will be the closing and the Q&A. So we're really excited. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat. We are here for it. We will do our best to answer your questions live, but one or the other, Julia or I may answer them in the chat. And also, if you're watching this as a recording, ask questions in the comments and we'll respond to those as well. All right. So welcome back to the end of our session from last time, where we were talking about small instructional shifts. At where we last left our heroes, we were talking about analysis. And we just wrapped up our webinar last time talking about how we could use PLC data chats around three-dimensional data and do some analysis with that data. So just to review really quickly where we were. So Inner Orbit uses so this is the formative assessment cycle on the left-hand side here, and on the right-hand side is Inner Orbit's data chat protocol. So we use 4 different stages. So first we ask teachers and or administrators to observe things. What do you see in your data? And then finally to do some analysis of those things. But what does that data suggest? And then later on implications, which that's where we are in our process. We're gonna lean into that in just a second. What next steps can we take? Then finally, the reflection piece, which is how did this analysis go? What do I want to do next time? And guess what? We're going to do this all together again later on in the session. But for today, we kind of want to skip into the implications piece because this is where we left last time. And so we had this data and we sat with the data and there were lots of different comments in the chat, which we have captured many of, and we'll display them in a moment. But we talked about, the data implications being, what are the implications of this data that we see down here? Maybe we can extend students' learning by doing this, or we can support students' growth by doing this. The idea here with implications is to look at specific action items, clarify the step that you're going to take and who might do it, and then, ultimately by when. So these are kind of like SMART goals, if you will. So we had y'all share your ideas in the Zoom chat, and here are some of those ideas that were shared in the chat last time. So folks said, maybe worth evaluating where graphs are supposed to be taught. And so if maybe it needs to be something that's taught at the elementary level before we get up to this higher level. Folks said, we need to concentrate more on scaffolding and practice and interpreting graphs. Someone else said we need a model for students how to analyze and interpret data. Like maybe they just haven't had that metacognition before. Like this is what I do when I analyze data. Maybe we want students to reflect themselves on this. And I used to do this in my exit slips. So I'd have questions about the content or whatever I taught on the front. And then on the back of an exit ticket, I would say, like, how do I feel about my learning for the day? And like, were there things that I, should have done better? It's a great, just like simple meta question. So what were you confused about and why? Or what would you like me to reteach you and why? And this is just like a great way to get feedback in any lesson, but specifically around analyzing interpreting data, which was what we're looking at in this data here. And then finally, somebody else suggested that we use targeted small groups to discuss differences between linear and non-linear terms. Because it was a vocab word issue that somebody identified, which I think was really, really smart. And then in addition, maybe we need simplified sets of data. Maybe we need to scaffold up. Don't give them this like big, scary, like graph that's like got multiple different, things that we're tracking on it, but just a really simple data set with a line or with a few bars, and that just shows us some really simple data. So all we're doing right now is going back over all of the content that we covered last time to make sure that the next section is clear and impactful. So we just want to be really, really clear about that. So we went through a data chat all together last time, and now we're looking at what we'll do next. So we did this reflection, we went over our implications. Now what? And so there are three things that we want to go through to talk about, like how you may change your instruction in the future in order to, foster more critical thinking and enhance student engagement. These are all things that we strongly recommend even for teachers to undergo. As with the NGSS, I think we see this in Open SciEd, teachers will sit and go through a lesson as students. And it's a really, really powerful thing because it's such a paradigm shift from how we learned that it's almost necessary to like be taught this stuff and experience it as a learner. So three of the different structures we recommend just as a small little adjustment to your instruction. We're not saying revamp your entire unit, but add these things on. So one are science talks. This is something that we actually modeled in the very, very beginning as a way to help teachers understand sense making a little bit better. And then we can do a differentiated review. So not just like throw in some big gnarly test at the kids, but let's differentiate this and let's use it as review. And then finally, we can allow students to undergo gallery walks. So I was a middle school teacher for a while, and getting kids off their butts and moving around the classroom is a really powerful way to just like have them be active, and then also to like move around and see how other folks approached similar problems, so other groups of students. Okay, so the first thing that we want to go over are these science talks. So science talks are a way for students to look at a novel phenomena. So we went through this in our first webinar, and so we'll drop in links to those things at the end of this. But in our first webinar, so science talks are a way for students or teachers to look at a phenomena and engage in, like, what do I notice? What do I wonder? How do I use the SEPs for this? How do I use the cross-cutting concepts for this? And really just exploring those connections. And that's something we can do as teachers, but you can also have your students sit down and say, like, let's say structure and function is the cross-cutting concept here. How is this asking you about how structure relates to function? This isn't like copying down the standards or like having them at the top of your worksheet, but asking them to say, how do those standards apply in the questions that I'm being asked about this phenomena? So we have these talk moves that we use where it's, very, very scaffolded and specific questions where students can be assigned them. One student can record. And these take like 5 to 10 minutes to go through. So this isn't a big, gnarly thing. It's just a chunk after your assessment. So you review the data, you're like students did not understand linear versus non-linear relationships. Well, give them another phenomena with another data set that is more simplistic, maybe, if you want, and have them go through and in a group discuss, like, what do I notice and wonder about this phenomena in the data set? And you can change the questions on this Science Talk guide to be really specific around the data set. So really, really, really important. Okay, great. So let's say we've gone through the science talks and we're looking for other opportunities, other ways to engage our students. Well, the other thing that we can do is a differentiated review. And so this is another tool, not to be used necessarily at the same time or right immediately before or after, but after the assessment, what can I do? So what I would do is I would select one performance expectation and one phenomena. And we would make 3 different versions of the assessment as options for students to review. And we're going to go over all the question types on an orbit in a little bit, so we can talk to you about how you would build this and what that looks like on the site. But essentially, we prepare a mild, a medium, and a spicy. So this is a hot ones NGSS version. And so as Shaq's shown us right there, like we're gonna bring the heat, but slowly. And so whether you're on the mild side of hot ones and you tap out after the first wing or the first like sniff of the first wing, that's great. Or whether you stick with it all the way through and you're unfazed by the heat, that's like what happens at the end. I'm not going to call out these celebrities who tap out early or who stick with it. But so the mild version would involve reviewing questions that are prior knowledge, so things that students should have learned at a prior grade level band, and then on grade level knowledge questions. So do you know things that I taught you? And do you know the things that you should have learned before here in my classroom? Then a medium version of this assessment would involve on grade level knowledge questions and then 2-dimensional questions. So we sometimes call these formative, or we have different names for them on the site. I'll show you in just a little bit. But these are ways for students to not just like say I know things, but I know things, and then I can make connections between that knowledge and a cross-cutting concept or an SCP. And the spicy version of the assessment can be, 2-dimensional questions and then 3-dimensional questions. And that way we can say, not only am I making connections between ideas, but I'm also like making sense of this phenomenon, answering really rigorous questions. So we have all of these different question types on Inner Orbit. And what you can do with this is you can, break students out into groups and give each group the different assessments. You can have students choose the assessment. There are lots of ways you can manage this in your classroom, but having an opportunity for students to then review that at either a low stakes, a mild, like not super spicy, or really, really go for it and, take an assessment that's really, really rigorous. But the idea here is that we can target how advanced and how spicy we want this review to be, but then and even differentiate it. So have like different students receive different versions or work in groups to answer those different questions. Okay, cool. And so option number 2, again, so we had science talks was number 1. Option number 2 is allow students a differentiated review. And then the third option are gallery walks. So this is really similar to the phenomena centers that we talked about before, except instead of walking around between centers, we're going to print out a bunch of summative assessments for the same standard with different phenomena and assign them to different groups. Students would use chart paper to record their thoughts and observations. And then once groups are done, they go around the classroom to do a gallery walk and to review these things. So you can have Post-its, they can stick you the Post-its on there to say like, oh, I noticed this, or I wonder about this, or I like this. There's lots of different ways you can manage this in your classroom. But the idea is we want students to make connections and maybe not necessarily have to go through and answer questions at each center, but see the ways other groups approached answering the questions at different centers through the gallery walk. And so that's like great. I used to use this and other sort of like Kagan strategies to get students up out of their seats and walking around in the classroom, especially middle school. This is really, really helpful. So strongly recommend that. So 3 different ways that you can take your data is we can do science talks. So just have students like notice and wonder around a new phenomena, see how the standards connect to the questions that you're asked. You could have them do differentiated review, give them options of mild, medium, and spicy assessments, or have them do a gallery walk and actually walk around and see the process that other students went through as they reviewed as they answered questions around a phenomena and an assessment. All right, great. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it off to Julia to talk to us not only about what we did after that one assessment, but now we're thinking about our entire assessment system. How are we going to change our future assessments after we just went through and gave an assessment, analyzed our data, and then maybe adjusted our instruction? Julia, what can we do now?
Thank you, Brandon. And as you were saying, we're going to dive into the assessment piece of this cycle one more time. So last time, if you remember, we were talking about how building common formative assessments helped us assess, right? So for this section of our webinar, we're going to come full circle and chat about what we recommend for reassessment after analysis and action have taken place. So we're going to think of these reassessments as post-assessments, with the initial assessment being a pre-assessment. We can, of course, think about these ideas as traditional pre-post assessments, but the context is the same. We assess, we analyze the data, we take some action, and then we assess again. So when we design pre and post assessments for 3-dimensional standards, we consider 2 specific factors at this point. the novelty of the phenomena, and second, the rigor of the questions we select. So let's see how this plays out specifically with some strategies. So these are 3 specific strategies we recommend for pre and post assessments on InterOrbit or in whatever platform you're using to assess your students. But this first one is using the same phenomena and the same questions in both assessments. The second one, we recommend to use different questions, but still the same phenomena from the pre-assessment. And for the last one, we recommend using completely different phenomena and questions. So for this first strategy, we would be creating a scaffolded formative assessment with questions that build up in rigor. And we've chosen a phenomena about how football players can keep their head in the game and how students would design solutions to prevent physical injuries during tackles. And for this first assessment, we would focus our first question on assessing the prior knowledge from previous grade levels. The second question would dive into the DCI, which is the content knowledge. The third question would target the DCI and the cross-cutting concept, which in this case is system and system models. The fourth question would focus on the DCI and the SCP, which is construction explanations and designing solutions. And finally, we would have a 3-dimensional questions that target the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concepts all together. Then we would replicate that same assessment and administer it after we've taken some instructional action. And something to note is that there will be minimal variables to consider in this data, since the assessment is the exact same for the pre-test and the post-test. And also, we only need to build one assessment and copy it, which is a nice thing. And something else to consider is that teachers should give time between the pre and post assessment to ensure students aren't just memorizing these questions. And for these reasons, going over the pre-test after students take it is not necessarily recommended for this strategy. So in this other scenario, with option 2, we are keeping the same phenomena, but we're building up in complexity to gather more helpful data. And in the second version of this assessment, we've reduced scaffolding significantly by just keeping 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional questions. So students coming back to the same phenomena twice and seeing their ability to answer a little bit more rigorous questions can help them see how their understanding has been growing over time. And using the same phenomena again twice might make the experience less novel. So something to consider one more time is that for this strategy, we don't recommend going over the pre-test either with students after they take it. And then finally, for our third option, our third strategy, in this last instance, we're using completely different phenomena and questions. So the second phenomena here is asking students to make sense of different egg cartons and how efficiently each of them can prevent eggs from breaking upon impact. So here we are asking students to show mastery of sense making or the standards, no matter what the phenomena is. So this would allow students to see multiple phenomena for the same concept and have 2 different unique opportunities to grapple with novel scenarios that they haven't been exposed to before. And this strategy has the most factors when we're analyzing data. So we have to think about the data that we collect as what are the implications? Again, the question we just asked in the beginning, what are the implications of this data? So an example, there might be a possible familiarity with one phenomenon, but not the other, or a student can be more interested in football and helmets than they would be on egg cartons. So that is something that we also need to consider when we're analyzing the data for these 2 assessments. And then in summary, with these 3 strategies, we should consider and find a balance between the novelty of the phenomena and the rigor of questions that we're aiming to achieve. It also depends what we're wanting to assess and in what point of the instruction we're at when we're giving these post assessments. I'm going to share in the chat some recommendations. Oh, thank you, Brendan, for these pre and post assessments. And now Brendan's going to show us how this would look on InterOrbit. Again, all of the questions taken from these slides were taken from InterOrbit. So let's take a look at it.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Julia, for walking us through that. So, buckle up, everyone. Let's talk about how InterOrbit can also make that easier for y'all as you go through and build those things. So InterOrbit is a pretty simple platform. So this is the actual website itself. And on here, I'm going to go ahead and search for a standard that is MSPS 2.1. And that's the standard we're looking at with forces of motion, those football, and those egg drops. So when you're on InterOrbit, you're going to scroll down. For this standard, we have 4 different phenomena. So when we talk about doing things like these gallery walks, or we talk about doing things like the differentiated review, each of these different phenomena can be one of those different touch points for students. And as you search for other standards on the site, so I'm going to search for MSPS 2.2. So you're going to have more and more phenomena. So this one has 5 different phenomena about bumper cars and roller coasters and space forces and dishes. And so all of these are different examples of taking that standard and giving you lots of different ways that those things can come to life, and students can apply their knowledge from what they learned in class to this novel thing, or what they learned looking at one of these phenomena to a different phenomena. And so let's go back to our MSPS 2.1, and I'm going to dive into one of these phenomena to show you what that might look like. And so we saw this football players one, and we saw the egg drop one. So let's look at the Mars rover. And so this phenomena is all about the idea, that we can use force and motion to better understand what's happening with when Mars's Perseverance touched down, or when NASA's Perseverance touched down on Mars. I'm like, Mars did not make Perseverance. And so we're looking at forces, we're looking at actions versus reactions with all these things. Newton's third law is the primary goal for students to be able to explain their knowledge of. So as you scroll down on inner orbit, you're going to see different question types. We went over this a couple of webinars ago, but we just wanted to show you what it looks like on the site. So when we talk about using the same phenomena and the same questions, you understand what that looks like. Using the same phenomena with different questions, you understand what that looks like. And if we're using different phenomena with different questions, we can show you what that looks like too. So the first questions are prior knowledge. These assess from middle school standard. These are going back to the 3rd grade level. We were saying, can you tell us what a prior grade level asks students to understand in preparation for the current grade level? So these are great questions, especially when you're providing really, really well scaffolded assessments to give at the very, very beginning. And so we have a few of those. There are 4 of those questions, and they all assess 3 PS22 and 3 PS21, which are the 2 different DCIs that articulate up to this middle school standard. Sometimes there's only a single DCI, a single element that articulates up. Sometimes there are lots. And so we go through and do that work. We find those things, we write questions on them, so you don't have to do this. And you can just analyze all that sweet data afterwards. The second question type are these what we call core content questions now. So these just focus on that core content. What do students need to know about that standard? So you'll see the DCI is now popping up here on the right-hand side for MSPS 2.1. And specifically, that's PS2A. And we also have the evidence statement tag up here, which we're not going to worry about too much, but that's what this little purple EVS is. As we scroll down, we're going to have a few different questions, specifically 4 questions on that same DCI, MSPS 2.1. So there are lots of different ways you can ask students about this, different drag and drop question types or multiple choice question types, but you're able to ask students about their knowledge. And again, that's like kind of the second level of scaffolding in orbit's assessment or questions. And after that, we'll get into 2-dimensional questions. So these questions hit the SEP, constructing explanations, and the DCI, forces in motion. So we have a couple of those questions in there as you get into the medium and spicier assessments. Or as Julia showed, we may have a really well scaffolded pre-assessment. The post-assessment might be 2- and 3-dimensional questions. So this is one flavor of 2D question. And the second are our content and concepts questions, which hit the cross-cutting concept and the DCI, leaving out the SEP. So we're not constructing explanations here. We're just looking at systems and system models and forces in motion. And so we'll have a couple questions about the cross-cutting concept and the DCI, and then we'll get into the juicy questions. And so these are questions that we call sense-making. They're 3-dimensional. So the SEP, the DCI, and the cross-cutting concept will all be present. And these are great questions for you to ask at the end of a unit or of student learning. And as you go through these, at the very, very bottom, you'll find our free response questions. So if you really want to push students to explain their thinking on how or why something is the way it is, then these are great questions for you to add. And we have these 3-dimensional rubrics that were very, very thoughtfully created to assess students on evidence of their understanding of the DCI, of the SEP, or of the cross-cutting concept. And so for each of these phenomena, you can click into each one of them, and you're going to see the same flow of questions. So prior knowledge questions, you're going to see questions that are core content questions, 2-dimensional questions on the cross-cutting concept or the SEP, and then 3-dimensional questions that follow. And so lots and lots and lots of options for building those assessments, because honestly, you got better things to do than to sit and write a whole bunch of questions and find a bunch of phenomena. So we are here to help with that. But let's just say you've gone through, and now we are sitting and we have given an assessment, a pre-assessment, we've given in a post-assessment, and now we're going to kind of do a whole group data chat on those two different assessments and the differences between that data. So we're going to walk you through a common formative assessment that one of our partners in Oklahoma City built, and kind of like walk you through a little bit about how they designed that assessment. So this was a same or different phenomena, but same questions. That's how these assessments were built. So version A involved how do sweat glands help us to thermoregulate? And then version B involved why do we shiver when we're cold? So this is a high school level standard. It's HSLS 1.3. And this standard focuses around the fact that there are, like different levels of organization within body systems and different smaller pieces like cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems that work together to maintain homeostasis. And that's what this standard is all about. And so I want to walk you through sort of how they designed this assessment and then what the data looked like. So version A is all about thermoregulation. Version B is all about thermoregulation, but obviously uses very different mechanisms for students to understand that. They used 5 total questions in each of these assessments. One was a content-only question. It's a one-dimensional question. One question that was a content and concepts, content and practices, and a sense-making question. And they were able to kind of mix those up. So I think some of these assessments had 2 sense-making questions. Some of them had 2 content and practices questions. But there were always 5 questions in the pre and the post assessment. So to show you what these phenomena look like, so why do we shiver when we're cold? Students are given a bunch of text about this, which is a common feature in these phenomena that we see on state tests. They're given like charts or tables or graphs of information to show different stages of hypothermia, and then also a model to show how, like different body parts, how the body thermoregulates between each of these different pieces. And so this is what students were essentially prompted with and given. And now we're going to look at what their assessment results look like afterwards. So in the first assessment that was given, this was the version A assessment that was given to, a group of students, not a small group of students. So 616 students took this assessment, and this was their data. And so as we look at this data, just take a look. There are DCIs up at the top, and then we have the SEP, this one SEP that was covered, and the cross-cutting concept, this one cross-cutting concept that was covered. This is all focused around one single assessment and one single performance expectation. So we don't have a bunch of different SEPs and a bunch of DCIs. It's just one DCI, one SEP, one cross-cutting concept. Those are the 3 dimensions. So take a moment and take a look at this data. If it's helpful and you want to be able to zoom in on it, I'm going to drop a link to a Google Drive format where you can see the pre-data, then also the post-data side by side, and be able to see how those things changed over time. And so if you look in the chat, you can click on that link and see the pre-test data versus the post-test data. All right, so I don't want to take too long on this slide because we're going to go to the post-test data. So for the version B assessment, now this was a separate phenomena. They were the same level of rigor of questions, but it was a different phenomena. So same DCI, same SEP, and same cross-cutting concept. And to make life easier for you, we went and wrote down the percentage change, the percentage point change on each of these questions. And so students went up 6 percentage points for the DCI, 18 percentage points for the SEP, and 8 percentage points for the cross-cutting concept. So what happened is that there was, some initial instruction and then the version A assessment, and then there was some remediation that happened after that, and the version B assessment was given. All right, so let's go through some observations and talk a little bit about what that data might look like. So Julie and I are going to model this for y'all so we can talk about that data and think about, like what are ways that we might process what happened here. And so first off, we're going to go through step 1 in our protocol, which is data observation. And we're going to look at, students excelled with this or students struggled with that. This is focused around just observations being made without judgment or interpretation. And so in that last slide, what we walked through were the dimensions reports on an orbit. And this looks at those 3 different dimensions and trying to figure out, where did students grow? So before we dive into the second part of our data analysis, and Julie and I go through that for a second piece of that, I guess I'm wondering, what do you see? What do you observe in this data? What were the changes, or where were there not changes that you would have expected there to be changes? So let's take a minute really quick. Julia, do you have any observations that you'd make here to see where students grew or where they didn't grow from the initial data set to the second data set?
Yeah, so staying without judgment, I noticed that students showed the most growth. or with the SCP, which was planning and carrying out investigations. What else do you see, Brendan?
So I see that students struggled, well, that they did not demonstrate as much growth around the DCI. And to stop my sentence there because I'm just observing things. So what do you think going on to our second question? So what is that? What does it mean? Let's do some quick analysis of this. Why do you think students may have struggled with A because of B or grown on A because of B?
So seeing how intertwined the cross-cutting concepts in the DCI are at this point, I would ask, like, is there a relationship? Did students struggle with the cross-cutting concept because they were struggling with the DCI too? What else do you see?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because the DCI is feedback, negative or positive, can stabilize or destabilize a system. And DCI is all about feedback mechanisms maintaining internal conditions, essentially homeostasis. And so I think it's really interesting. Maybe feedback, positive and negative feedback, were something that students struggle with because I see that as a similarity between both of these. Whereas the planning, care, and investigations, it almost appears to be a separate skill.
Correct.
Cool. And then we can go through our third step in this, which are the implications of that data. And so this popped up in the chat just a minute ago, which is, like what was done. So students, like did better with the SEP. And so what I see in here is I wonder, it looks like this teacher may have given them some like significant scaffolding that was very productive. This 18 percentage point gain from a pre-test to a post-test on a novel phenomena, that's fantastic. That is excellent. That shows that there was some scaffold in there that worked really, really well for these students. And so that's really, really powerful that we were able to take students from, like from the SCP. And I think as we talk to stakeholders across the country, the SCPs are kind of the thing that we really want to improve students on. And so there are scaffolds and reteaches. Usually what happens in this district is teams of teachers come together, they look at the data together, and they decide on next steps together. And so there was probably some very clear scaffold that was given for students to be able to, like look at the data inside of the investigation that was being given, or deciding on the accuracy of that data, and looking at different ways to measure that data or consider limitations of the precision of that data. And so my guess is that teacher went through and did some really significant review with kiddos before they took the post-test. So some implications for this in my mind are we need to talk about feedback. We need to talk about positive feedback. We need to talk about negative feedback. We probably need to do an entire, like chunk on just those two terms and those two types of feedback, and allow students to see what those look like and maybe give examples from their own life of what those things look like. Are there any implications for you in this data, Julia?
So I wonder if any of that, and also thinking about what Brian just said, are there any scaffolds that happened with the SCP that we could replicate in order for students to understand, to make further sense of stability and change and feedback mechanisms too?
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, now that was great. And we wanted to show you what this data looks like when we're looking at a pre-test versus a post-test. But now let's dive into not just looking at this is our dimensions report data, but looking at that data and going through the same process with our question level data. So for this partner district in particular, they like to go through and look at our question level data. So what we've done here is sort of simplified InnoOrbit's assignment report to give you an example, sort of like a simplified sample of what that might look like. And so if you at the district level or at the school level or in the classroom level are going through your data, you can figure out, oh, okay, so what are the different ways that I can look at this data? So what we did was we took one of those 5 question assessments and we sort of color coded each of the question types here. And so what we have here are question types. The one-dimensional question type, students scored green, which means they were proficient in that. So, and this is the same assessment again that we're just looking at prior. And so the two-dimensional content and concepts is red. That means students did really poorly on that question. The two-dimensional question, the next core content and concepts question, students scored yellow, which is a little bit better, but still, we're not looking at proficient and advanced. We're looking at approaching proficiency. And then for the SEP, DCI question, and the 3D question, students scored in the green. And so this is really, really interesting. Julia, what do you see here?
So I see that students excelled with the two-dimensional questions. And I also see that students excelled with the three-dimensional question, which is really interesting. What do you see?
Well, I don't agree. I don't think they excelled in all the two-dimensional questions. I think they struggled with every time the cross-cutting concept was there, that those were tough questions for them to perform well on. But I'm definitely surprised that they did really well in the 2D practices and content questions, and they did really well on the 3D question. So let's go on to the second stage of this. I feel like I just want to get into it and do some analysis. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's analyze this data. And again, the second stage in our data check protocol is, what does this data suggest? So we can say maybe they struggle with X because of Y, or students maybe understand A because of B. We did a little bit of this when we looked at the dimensions report data, but now we're seeing it kind of like at a different angle. And I'm curious if any of our analysis from before still resonates, or if there are things that you saw here, and you're like, oh, I think it's something different. Julia, do you want to talk about some of your analyses here?
Sure. I wasn't sure if you were talking to me or to the audience, but yeah. So I really think it's interesting that the two-dimensional question they struggled the most with the cross-cutting concept is actually that they struggled understanding what a stable state in the body is. So I wonder if there are any implications or misconceptions even with the concept of stability.
Or instability too, which I think is really interesting too, is understanding, it's just like understanding feedback or stability is great. And we have lots of examples of negative feedback, but positive feedback is a totally different thing. And understanding both sides of that is really, really important. So what this also pulls out for me is that students definitely are struggling with the cross-cutting concept here. Like that is like, it is clear to me, clear as day, that it's not the DCI, and or at least the questions about the DCI were not the struggle. And it does not appear that it's so either those questions were funky and it was difficult for students to decode those questions, which that's possible, or they really don't understand stability or instability, or they really don't understand feedback and like positive or negative feedback. Good. I see a comment in the chat also that said maybe students don't understand what homeostasis really means. And so what's really interesting about that comment is this first question up here. It talks about the most important functioning of shivering is to, so this question may have actually asked them not about homeostasis, but just like maintaining body temperature. And so it may have negated to assess them on the term homeostasis. But then these questions down here, so this says homeostasis, shivering is an attempt of the body to, and I anticipate that this question probably asks about homeostasis too, or maybe even references it in one of the answers. And so we can look at the questions. And so on Orbit, when you look at the reports, you're able to see very specifically what parts of the question and the answers students chose and why they chose those things. Not why they chose those things, but which ones, what the breakdown was between each of the different answer choices. And so this is super, super interesting. But what I see here is I see red and I see homeostasis being tied together. And that's really interesting. Cool. I love the comments in the chat too. Yeah, the academic vocabulary that's involved in these questions is definitely something that we need to make sure that we review over time to ensure that students can access these questions. I think we talk about accessibility of questions, and if students don't have the jargon that's needed to be able to decode and answer the questions, that can be a struggle. So the NGSS is not, we're not going to have like a ton of like flashcards for students to be going through. But if you don't know what homeostasis is, and the standard talks about homeostasis like the DCI does, and the cross-cutting concept refers to homeostasis, then you're gonna have a rough time. Okay, cool. This is great, y'all. Thank you for going through that with me. So let me clear my little chicken scratch drawings here, and then we can go into the next slide, which is I'm going to leave to y'all in the chat to talk about the implications of this data. So what are the implications for teaching and for assessment? So what are you going to do in the next 24 to 48 hours to either extend students' learning or support student growth? And so here we're going to consider specific action items. So what would you do, when are you going to do it, and who's going to do it? So go ahead and write your responses in the chat. I'm going to make sure when you respond in the chat that you just have that like blue pill set to everyone instead of hosts and panelists. Julie and I would love to hear your responses, but we want to make sure everybody gets to hear what y'all are thinking. So take a minute, take a look at this data, and tell us what you would do in your classroom. And I guess more specifically too, just to give you some options for this, is if you know that academic vocabulary is a struggle, or those process terms, those cross-cutting concepts are a struggle, what are ways you might approach that in your own classroom that have been successful for you? Cool. So just wanted to call out some of the things I'm seeing in the chat. So I love the idea of doing hands-on labs. So obviously, if you can get students to connect a real experience with a word, a vocab word, that's going to be really, really impactful. So calling out that balancing act lab that's like a part of the regents, that's fantastic. Brian mentioned so positive being good and negative being bad, that maybe there are some misconceptions and like, because that is what those things mean in a different context, but not in the context of feedback mechanisms. And so that might be a really interesting thing to dig into. And I love this. I see comments about reading comprehension. So that's a whole different thing, which is, like were students able to access this? And but by this point, so if you've given assessments in your classroom, you may have some idea of that. Whenever I give things that have 500 words versus less than 50, students do better on the shorter passages than on the longer passages. But this could help give you a base of data to judge that. I would say so for this particular phenomena, I don't know that it's reading comprehension because they did really well on the 3D questions. They did really well on the content and practices questions. And the practice here is planning code investigations, which does involve a significant amount of comprehension. Students aren't even just looking at the text, but at the tables and the graphs and the models that are in there too. So it might not be reading comprehension for this one, but I think it's always something to look out for. Yep. So more vocab and definitions, especially if that was embedded in a platform, that would be fantastic. Great. Okay, great suggestions, y'all. Super, super interesting. So then we'll go over a final, just real quick. We'll boop this on the nose. So there's different ways that we can reflect from our data. Don't worry about sharing your thoughts in the chat for right now. We always want to give time for us to sort of like consider, like what could we have done? What questions arose about teaching and assessment? Were there questions about equity? And if they didn't come up, then why not? Was there additional analysis that you might want to complete, like maybe a reassessment later on? And then what are the things you want to try in your classroom as a result of this data? And maybe it's more hands-on labs that are connected to vocabulary. That was a really interesting thing that came up more than once in the chat, which is great. Cool. So we've now reached the end of our time together, and I'm really, really excited to have been here with y'all for us to go through this. So our webinar today was around peak performance and working on how we can extend our work for the NGSS beyond that initial piece of this. Thank you all so much for joining us for this. We talked about responding to data with small and smart structural shifts. We talked about changing future assessments, and we talked about different types of data chats. So looking at version A and a version B, and then going over our question level analysis. This is not something we've done very frequently and talked about, but we have some of our districts that are really, really deep into this. So if you want to see our initial NGSS capacity or the strength training, distance training webinar. So those are the two that lead up to this one. We'll also drop them into the description of the video. But thank you all so much for being with us through this. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.